The old house on Pine Meadow Street had never felt so quiet. 78-year-old Walter Emerson sat in his kitchen, stirring hot coffee and watching dust motes dance in the afternoon light, streaming through windows that Mary had always kept spotless. 3 months had passed since her funeral, and the silence pressed against him, like a physical weight, suffocating in its completeness. The walls seemed to echo with phantom sounds 45 years of shared laughter, gentle arguments about his stubbornness, and whispered late-night conversations that would never come again. Every room held memories that cut like glass. Her reading chair still bore the impression of her small frame. Her coffee mug sat unwashed in the sink because washing, it felt too much like erasing her. The neighbors had stopped bringing casseroles weeks ago, and the phone calls from concerned friends had dwindled to nothing. Walt existed in a bubble of grief, going through the motions of living without truly being alive. Walt pushed himself from the table, his joints protesting after sitting too long, and climbed the creaking stairs to the second floor. He'd been avoiding the attic for weeks, but Mary's voice seemed to whisper from beyond, with that familiar mixture of love and exasperation. "Those boxes won't sort themselves, you stubborn old goat. And don't you dare leave this mess for David to clean up." The pull-down ladder groaned under his weight. As he ascended into the dusty darkness above, each rung a small victory over the inertia that had claimed his days. Boxes labeled in Mary's careful, cursive handwriting lined the walls like patient sentinels. Christmas decorations, photo albums, his father's belongings from the war, her mother's china they'd never used. In the far corner, beneath a moth-eaten army blanket, something caught his eye. The familiar angular shape made his heart skip unexpectedly. His father's ham radio, untouched for 30 years, waiting like a sleeping giant. Walt pulled away the blanket with reverent hands, disturbing a cloud of dust that made him sneeze violently. The radio sat like a mechanical altar from another era, its dials and switches dulled by time, but miraculously intact. Chrome knobs reflected the weak attic light, and the speaker cloth bore only a few small tears. He remembered being 12 years old, perched on a wooden stool beside his father in the basement workshop, fascinated by voices emerging from thin air like magic. Strangers from Australia, Norway, Japan, all connected by invisible waves bouncing off the atmosphere. After the war, his father had used the radio less and less. The thrill of distant conversations, gradually replaced by the immediate demands of family life and work. Eventually, it became just another forgotten relic, banished to the attic when they'd renovated the basement in the 70s. Walt had barely thought about it in decades, yet seeing it now brought back vivid memories of his father's patient explanations about frequencies and propagation. The careful ritual of tuning and listening, now running his weathered fingers over the cold metal chassis. Walt felt a spark of something he'd forgotten existed in his grief-numbed world, genuine curiosity. The operator's manual lay beneath the radio, its pages yellow and brittle but still readable. Technical diagrams that once seemed like hieroglyphs now looked familiar, awakening dormant knowledge from his engineering days. He carefully lifted both the radio and manual, surprised by how heavy the old equipment was, and carried them down to his workshop in the basement. For the next week, Walt lost himself completely in the restoration process. He cleaned decades of dust from every component, tested circuits with his old multimeter, and made careful notes of what needed replacement. Replacing vacuum tubes became a treasure hunt through electronics shops, and he found himself actually looking forward to each day's progress. His hands steady despite their age, and the slight tremor that had developed recently remembered skills from his engineering career. Mary would have laughed to see him so focused, tongue poking from the corner of his mouth like a determined schoolboy tackling a difficult problem. When he finally powered it on that Friday evening, the gentle electrical hum that filled the basement workshop sounded like a choir of angels. The radio lived again, its meters glowing warmly in the dim light. Walt sat back in his chair, surprised by the tears on his cheeks. On a particularly lonely Thursday evening, Walt sat before the restored radio in his basement workshop, surrounded by the familiar smell of solder and electrical components. The house above him seemed especially empty tonight, every creak and settling sound amplified in the silence. Mary's chair in the living room felt like an accusation, a reminder of conversations that would never happen again. On impulse, motivated more by desperation than confidence, he reached for the microphone with hands that trembled slightly. "CQ, CQ. This is KD3 Walt calling CQ and standing by." The words felt foreign on his lips after so many decades, but somehow right, like riding a bicycle after years of walking. His voice echoed in the small basement room as static answered him, white noise that seemed to mock his attempt at connection. He cleared his throat and tried again, his voice gaining confidence with each word. "Any station, any station. This is KD3 Walt in Pennsylvania, looking for a friendly conversation. Anyone out there tonight?" More static filled the speaker, punctuated by brief bursts of distant conversations in languages he couldn't identify. Walt was about to give up, feeling foolish for expecting miracles from old equipment and older hopes, when suddenly, breakthrough, "KD3 Walt, this is W7 Maeve in Oregon. You sound a little rusty there, neighbor." Walt's heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. A woman's voice, warm with gentle humor, and surprisingly clear across the continental divide. He fumbled with the microphone, nearly dropping it in his excitement. "7 Maeve, this is Walt. You're absolutely right about the rust. It's been about 40 years since I've done this, maybe longer. Well, Walt from Pennsylvania, you picked a good night." To dust off the microphone, "I'm Maeve, and I just fired up my rig for the first time in decades myself. Seems we're both getting reacquainted with old friends tonight." Her voice carried a musical quality that reminded him somehow of Mary's laugh. Though they sounded nothing alike, there was something in her tone, a mixture of loneliness and hope, that resonated with his own fractured heart. "What brought you back to the airwaves, Maeve?" "Same as you, I'd guess. Too many quiet evenings and too many empty rooms. Sometimes you need to reach out into the darkness and see if anyone reaches back." Their conversations became Walt's salvation, a nightly ritual that gave structure to his aimless days. Every evening at 8 o'clock sharp, he would pour himself a coffee, settle into the basement workshop chair. He'd made more comfortable with Mary's old quilted cushion, and tuned to their frequency. Maeve was always there, her voice, a lighthouse cutting through the fog of his grief and isolation. She painted pictures with words of her cottage overlooking the Columbia River, where she could watch barges navigate the wide waters and osprey dive for salmon. She spoke of losing her husband, Tom, 2 years ago to a sudden heart attack, of finding herself rattling around in a house built for two, of rediscovering her father's radio equipment in much the same way Walt had found his. Her honesty about grief gave him permission to share his own pain. Walt told her about Mary, about how she'd made their farmhouse feel like the center of the universe, about the 40 acres they'd owned before retiring to town, where they'd raised chickens and grown enough vegetables to feed half the neighborhood. He spoke hesitantly about David, their only child, who lived in Seattle and called twice a year out of obligation rather than love, their relationship fractured by arguments. Walt could barely remember, but somehow couldn't repair. "You know what Tom used to say?" Maeve's voice crackled through the static one evening, while rain drummed against Walt's basement windows. He'd say that some bridges need to be rebuilt from both ends, but somebody has to start laying the first board. Sounds like a wise man. What did he do? Carpenter by trade, philosopher by nature. Built beautiful things with his hands and never met a broken relationship. He didn't think could be fixed with patience and the right tools. Walt sipped his coffee, thinking of the growing distance between him and David. Years of small slights and misunderstandings that had accumulated, like sediment in a riverbed. Maybe some bridges are too far gone. Maybe, Maeve said softly, but maybe they're just waiting for someone brave enough to take that first step into the water. Their conversations meandered through decades of memories, shared regrets and gentle encouragement. Walt found himself laughing more than he had in months, sometimes at Maeve's dry observations about growing old, sometimes at his own fumbling attempts to work his father's old radio equipment. She had a gift for finding humor in the mundane struggles of widowhood, and he discovered he could still make someone laugh with his stories of learning to cook after 45 years of Mary's meals. "You know what's strange?" Maeve said one evening, her voice carrying an odd mixture of excitement and disbelief. "My father was a radio operator in the Pacific during the war, Navy communications aboard the USS Portland. He used to tell me stories about the voices that kept him company during those long night watches, talking to other operators scattered across the Pacific theater." Walt nearly dropped his coffee mug, his hand suddenly unsteady. "My dad was Army Signal Corps, European theater initially, but he got transferred to Pacific operations in '44. He used to tell me stories about talking to ships and bases all over the Pacific, how those radio conversations were lifelines during the darkest parts of the war." "What was his call sign?" Maeve's voice was barely above a whisper, as if she were afraid of the answer. "KD-3 Thomas. He kept it after the war, used it, right up until he stored the radio in the attic, back in the '80s. The silence stretched across the continent, filled only with the gentle hiss of static, and the sound of Walt's own heartbeat thundering in his ears. When Maeve finally spoke, her voice trembled. "Walt, I think our fathers might have talked." Maeve's revelation sent both of them on frantic archaeological expeditions through dusty boxes and forgotten corners. In her father's sea chest, carefully preserved behind mothballs and tissue paper, she found a detailed logbook with entries from 1944 and 1945. including several conversations with someone identified as Tom from PA. Good man, steady voice in rough weather. Walt discovered his father's war chest in the basement storage room, behind paint cans and Christmas decorations he'd forgotten existed. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, he found letters from home, commendations, a Purple Heart he'd never seen before, and a small notebook filled with radio contacts. There, in his father's careful engineer's handwriting, he found multiple entries spanning months in 1944. Maeve's dad, Oregon-bound sailor, talks about home fishing, good man to pass dark hours with. The entries painted a picture of two young men, thousands of miles apart, finding comfort in each other's voices during the uncertainty of war. They'd talked about home, about fears and hopes, about the girls they'd left behind, and the future they were fighting to preserve. But it was the photograph that stopped Walt cold. Tucked carefully in his father's worn Bible, between the pages of Ecclesiastes, he found a black and white snapshot. Two young men in military uniforms standing beside a makeshift radio setup. Palm trees visible in the background. One was clearly his father, recognizable despite his youth. On the back, in his father's handwriting, Tom and Jim, somewhere in the Pacific, 1944. Good man, this sailor. Hope to meet again stateside. When Walt described the photo to Maeve during their next conversation, she gasped audibly across the static. That sounds exactly like my father. Same dimpled chin, same crooked smile that my mother fell in love with. Walt, I think I have the other half of that story. In her father's sea chest, Maeve had discovered something that made her hands shake as she held it. A letter, never sent, written on Navy stationery and addressed to Thomas Emerson, Pennsylvania. The envelope was sealed, yellow with age, and bore a postmark from San Francisco, dated October 1945. With Walt listening on the radio, Maeve carefully opened the letter her father had written 78 years ago. Her voice trembled as she read aloud. The words that had waited decades to be heard. Dear Tom, if you're reading this, it means I found the courage to send what I should have sent months ago. You were more than just a voice in the static during those dark Pacific nights. You were a lifeline, a reminder that somewhere in this big world, there was still decency and hope. The letter told of a promise made between two radio men who'd become friends across impossible distances, connected by nothing more than radio waves and shared humanity. They'd agreed to meet after the war, to introduce their families, to maintain their friendship beyond the static and chaos of combat. But life intervened, as it always does, with its urgent demands and gradual erosions of good intentions. Her father wrote of coming home to Oregon, of marriage and children, and the consuming business of building a civilian life from the ruins of war. He spoke of meaning to write, of thinking about Tom from Pennsylvania during quiet moments, of wondering what happened to the voice that had kept him sane during those long Pacific watches. The letter ended with an address in Portland and an invitation that was never extended. Come visit when you can. My door is always open to the man who helped me. Remember what we were fighting for. Walt spent the next evening in his basement workshop, staring at the radio that had brought Maeve's voice into his life and thinking about the courage It must have taken his father to reach out across the Pacific darkness to find human connection. He thought about the letter that never got sent, the meeting that never happened, and the friendship that had been severed not by conflict or betrayal, but by the simple inertia of everyday life. They never got to meet, Maeve had said softly. The night before, her voice heavy with the weight of missed opportunities. Two good men who found each other in the worst of times, and then let the best of times pull them apart. But maybe we can finish what they started, Walt had replied, surprising himself with the boldness of the thought. He'd been thinking about it all day, the idea, growing from a whisper to a shout in his mind. 3 weeks later, Walt stood in his driveway at dawn, loading a carefully packed suitcase into his old pickup truck. The neighbors had watched his preparations with barely concealed amazement and concern. Walt Emerson, who hadn't driven farther than the grocery store since Mary's funeral, was embarking on a cross-country journey that would have challenged men half his age. Mrs. Henderson from next door approached with obvious worry etched on her weathered face. "Are you absolutely sure about this, Walt? Driving all that way by yourself? What if something happens? What if the truck breaks down in the middle of nowhere?" Walt smiled, feeling more alive and purposeful than he had in months, maybe years. The morning air smelled of possibility, and for the first time since Mary's death, he was eager to see what the day might bring. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm 78, not dead yet. Besides, someone's waiting for me in Oregon, and I've got a promise to keep that's been 78 years in the making." The drive took him 4 days through landscapes that reminded him why this country was worth fighting for and growing old in. Rolling farmland gave way to prairie vastness, then mountain grandeur that made him pull over just to stare in wonder. Each evening he and Maeve would talk on their portable radios, her voice guiding him westward like a homing beacon through the static of distance and time. When Walt finally pulled into the gravel driveway beside the Columbia River, she was waiting on the porch, exactly as she'd promised. A woman with silver hair and kind eyes, who somehow looked exactly as he'd imagined during their countless conversations. She was smaller than he'd expected, but carried herself with a dignity that spoke of inner strength. They stood there for a long moment, two strangers who weren't strangers, connected by voices and history, and the invisible threads that bind lonely hearts across impossible distances. "Hello, Walt from Pennsylvania," she said, her voice carrying the same warmth in person that had sustained him through so many lonely evenings. "Hello, Maeve from Oregon," he replied, and they both began to laugh, the nervous tension of weeks of anticipation dissolving into genuine joy. Walt spent a week in Oregon, and they filled every day with discovery and connection. They visited the places her father had loved, including the small harbor, where he'd docked after the war, and shared meals overlooking the river, while barge traffic moved like slow dreams through the wide water. Maeve showed him her father's workshop, still preserved exactly as he'd left it, and Walt shared stories of his own father's basement laboratory, where electronics and dreams had mingled. Each evening, they would sit beside her father's restored radio, listening to other voices, finding each other across the darkness, part of the great invisible community that spans the globe. Walt began to understand that their friendship was part of something larger, a network of human connection that transcended technology and time. On his last night, Walt's cell phone rang unexpectedly. David's number showed on the screen, and Walt answered with surprise, wondering what emergency might prompt his son to call outside their usual Christmas and birthday schedule. "Dad? I've been calling the house for 3 days straight. Where are you? I was about to call the police. I'm in Oregon, son. Visiting a friend." The words felt natural, comfortable, like something the old Walt might have said before grief, and isolation had built walls around his heart. The conversation that followed was the longest and most honest they'd had in years. David listened with growing amazement as Walt told him about Maeve, about the radio, about discovering connections that transcend time and distance, and the stubborn silences that separate families. Something in Walt's voice, a vitality and purpose that had been missing since Mary's. Death seemed to reach across the miles and touch his son's heart. "Dad, you sound different, happy," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "I haven't heard you like this in so long." Walt looked out at the Columbia River, where moonlight painted silver paths across the dark water, and felt the truth of it settle in his chest. "I suppose I am, son. For the first time in a long while, I am." When David asked if he could visit soon, if maybe they could have dinner, and Walt could tell him more about this friend and the radio world, he'd discovered, Walt found himself saying yes without hesitation. The walls that grief had built were coming down, one conversation at a time. After they hung up, Maeve found him still standing by the window, phone in hand. "Everything all right?" "Better than all right," Walt said, turning to face this woman, who had helped him remember that voices carry more than words. They carry hope, connection, and the promise that no one has to be alone in the darkness. "I think I'm finally ready to tune back into the world." That night, as they made their final contact on her father's radio, Walt realized that the frequencies had taught him something profound about grief and healing. Like radio waves traveling through space, love doesn't disappear. When someone dies, it just changes form, waiting to be received by those willing to listen. Mary's voice might be silent now, but the love they'd shared had found new channels, connecting him to David, to Maeve, to the vast network of human hearts that pulse with the same need for understanding across the endless night.